The account that follows draws from federal court records, declassified FBI files, Senate testimony, and published historical documentation. Where evidence is contested or incomplete, it is presented as such. September 1963. A file folder lands on a table in a United States Senate hearing room. Inside it, photographs, organizational charts, handwritten names, and something no federal agency had ever successfully entered into public record. A governing body. A board of directors for organized crime in America. The man who put it there was named Joseph Valachi. Valachi was not a boss. He was not even a captain. He was a soldier, a low-ranking member of the Genovese family, convicted on narcotics charges, sitting in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, believing his own boss had marked him for death. What he gave the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in exchange for protection was something prosecutors had been trying to prove for 30 years. He gave them the architecture. Senator John McClellan presided over the hearings. Chief Counsel Robert Kennedy sat to his left. And Valachi, small, nervous, sweating under the lights, began to describe a structure that most of Washington had officially pretended did not exist. The senator asked what this organization called itself. Senator McClellan's counsel put the question directly. Mr. Valachi, what name do the members use for this organization? We called it Cosa Nostra. That means, Nodal, our thing. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of recognition. Federal agents in the gallery had suspected it. Some had documented pieces of it. But no one had ever named it from the inside, under oath, in public, in front of cameras. The commission, the body that Valachi described as sitting above all the families, settling disputes, authorizing executions, dividing territory, Noonan had a name. It had a structure. And now it had a record. What is remarkable about the Valachi testimony is not only what it revealed, it is what it confirmed had been hidden for 3 decades. Not through secrecy alone, but through institutional denial at the highest levels of American law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover had publicly insisted for years that no national crime syndicate existed. The files his own agents had compiled suggested otherwise. What the record shows, looking back, is that the commission had been operating in plain sight of government apparatus that chose, for reasons still not fully documented, not to look directly at it, but to understand what Valachi was describing, to understand why the room went quiet. You have to go back. Back 30 years. Back to a man who did not invent organized crime in America. He simply organized it. Salvatore Lucania, known to every newspaper in New York as Lucky Luciano, was 23 years old when he began building the system that would govern American organized crime for the next 5 decades. By 1931, he was done building it. The year 1931 matters. 2 men stood between Luciano and the consolidation of power, Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both died within 6 months of each other. Both, according to subsequent testimony, at Luciano's direction. Their deaths ended what historians of organized crime call the Castellamarese War, a bloody 2-year struggle for dominance among New York's Italian-American criminal factions. What Luciano built in the silence after that war was not an empire. It was a constitution. The commission, as Luciano conceived it, had a specific purpose: not to run crime, but to govern it. It would settle territorial disputes without resort to war. Because war, as the previous 2 years had demonstrated, was expensive, visible, and ultimately unprofitable. It would authorize major operations, approve or deny significant executions, mediate conflicts between families, and it would, in theory, prevent any single man from accumulating enough power to dominate the others. In theory, the original commission included representatives from 5 New York families: Luciano, Mangano, Gagliano, Lucchesi, and Bonanno. along with bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and other cities. Chicago's Al Capone was already in federal custody on tax charges by the time the structure was formalized. The commission met without him. It did not, notably, appear to miss him. Joseph Bonanno, who would later write a memoir describing his role in the early commission, characterized its purpose in language that sounds almost parliamentary. The commission was a forum. It was not a government. It could advise, suggest, admonish. But it could not compel. The power always rested with the individual bosses. The records suggest Bonanno's account is selective. The commission did more than advise. Declassified FBI surveillance documents and subsequent trial testimony indicate it authorized the murder of members who violated its rules. It divided territory with enforceable boundaries. It levied what functioned as taxation on certain criminal operations. The distinction between advising and governing in the commission's case was often the difference between compliance and a body in a car trunk. What the commission gave organized crime was not power. It already had that. What it gave them was durability, a mechanism for absorbing internal conflict without self-destruction. A set of procedures, however brutally enforced, that allowed the enterprise to outlast any single personality. Luciano himself would be deported to Italy in 1946, following a conviction on compulsory prostitution charges. The commission continued without him. That was precisely the point. By the late 1940s, the 5 New York families had stabilized into the structure that federal investigators would eventually call the 5 Families Cry: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. The commission sat above all of them, and for nearly 20 years, called through war, through post-war prosperity, through the explosion of narcotics trafficking and the collapse of labor union corruption into something almost systematized. It remained largely invisible to the American public. Then came November 1957, and a farm in upstate New York. The town of Apalachin, New York. Population approximately 300. On the 14th of November 1957, the State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell noticed an unusual number of large, expensive automobiles parked outside the estate of Joseph Barbara, a beverage distributor with a known criminal record. Croswell set up a roadblock. What he found coming through it would become the most consequential accidental law enforcement action in the history of American organized crime. 63 men were stopped or identified at the Apalachin meeting. Their names read like a directory of organized crime leadership across the United States. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno. Bosses, underbosses, and senior captains to Tizhad Lamacha from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Florida, and beyond. They had gathered, according to later testimony, to address unfinished business following the murder of Albert Anastasia weeks earlier. The commission had business to conduct. It conducted it very publicly. The embarrassment for federal law enforcement was severe. Here, in one field, was the organizational chart that J. Edgar Hoover had insisted did not exist. Dozens of senior figures. Multiple cities. One meeting. The FBI's official position on the existence of a national crime syndicate had to be reconsidered almost overnight. Whether that reconsideration was genuine or politically managed is a question the documentary record alone cannot fully answer. Former FBI agent William Romer, who later became one of the Bureau's leading organized crime specialists, described the institutional shock of Apalachin in an interview recorded for the historical record. Apalachin blew the lid off everything. Nobody could pretend anymore. Here were 60-some of the most powerful criminals in the country, caught in the same place at the same time. It confirmed what some of us already knew and others refused to believe. Prosecutions followed. Conspiracy convictions were obtained against 20 of the attendees. Though those convictions were subsequently overturned on appeal in 1960. when a federal appeals court ruled that simply attending a meeting without proof of criminal purpose was insufficient for conviction. The men walked. The commission, shaken but intact, continued. What Apalachin produced in the long run was more significant than any single conviction. It produced attention, congressional scrutiny, the McClellan hearings, Valachi, the formation of dedicated organized crime units within the FBI, and, slowly, the legal tools that would eventually be pointed directly at the commission itself. The meeting that was supposed to be invisible became the reason the commission was ultimately put on trial. That is the particular irony of Apalachin. They gathered to manage order. They created the conditions for their own exposure. By the 1980s, the commission was under surveillance. FBI listening devices had penetrated the social clubs and back offices where commission business was discussed. Wiretap authority had expanded under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970. The commission knew it was being watched, and then it authorized something that guaranteed it would not survive the decade. Paul Castellano, known as Big Paul, had led the Gambino family since the death of Carlo Gambino in 1976. He was cautious, corporate in manner, deeply uncomfortable with the kind of street-level violence that other bosses still trafficked in. He was also, according to surveillance records, deeply resented by a faction within his own family, led by a captain named John Gotti. The tension between Castellano and Gotti had multiple dimensions. Financial disputes over the division of proceeds. Gotti's narcotics operations, which Castellano had officially banned within the family. And a personal dynamic between two men who, according to those present at meetings recorded by FBI surveillance, barely concealed their mutual contempt. By the fall of 1985, Gotti had made a decision. He had not, according to the evidence, secured commission approval for what he was about to do. December 16, 1985. Paul Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bellotti, were shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. It was early evening. The street was crowded. Castellano was 69 years old. He died on the sidewalk in front of witnesses. Gotti's calculation was brutally simple. If he moved first, and moved fast enough, and consolidated power quickly enough, when the commission would accept the result as fact. It was the logic of a hostile takeover, the kind that only works if the target does not survive long enough to object. The problem was not the murder itself. The problem was what it represented, and who had not been consulted. Former federal prosecutor Michael Chertoff, who worked on organized crime cases in the Southern District of New York during this period, later described the Castellano killing as a structural rupture, not merely a power shift. When Gotti killed Castellano without commission approval, he broke the one rule that had held the structure together for 50 years. The commission was supposed to authorize that kind of action. He just decided he didn't need it. That was the beginning of the end, not just for Gotti, but for the whole structure as it had existed. Gotti was not immediately punished. He was initially accepted. The other families, already weakened by ongoing federal pressure, their own internal disputes, the attrition of key figures to prosecution, Neyrelis did not move against him. Whether this acceptance represented genuine authority or simply the paralysis of men who understood that the same logic that killed Castellano could be pointed at them. The record does not clearly show. What the record does show is that Gotti's rise was accompanied by a visibility that the commission had, since its founding, treated as an existential threat. Press conferences on courthouse steps. Nickname, the Dapper Don. Acquittals celebrated as public theater. He was making the commission's business a public performance. And federal investigators, who had already been building their case for years, were watching every moment of it. case against the commission did not begin with... It began with a listening device planted inside the basement of a private social club in Staten Island, known as the Palmer Boys Social Club, and in the apartment above a tailor shop on Mulberry Street, and in the car of Genevieve's boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. FBI Operation Genus had been running since 1982. The evidence it produced was, by the standards of organized crime prosecution, extraordinary. Not rumors, not informant claims that could be discredited on cross-examination. Conversations, voices, names, decisions, the actual administrative language of the commission, captured on tape in the voices of the men who ran it. The legal vehicle was RICO. United States Attorney Rudolph Giuliani made the filing in 1985. The defendants were not soldiers or street-level figures. They were the commission itself, or as close to it as federal prosecutors had ever been able to reach. Salerno of the Genovese family. Anthony Corallo, known as Tony Ducks, of the Lucchese family. Carmine Persico of the Colombo family. Philip Rastelli of the Bonanos, and Castellano the Seckel, who was indicted before he was murdered. The wiretap transcripts became the spine of the prosecution's case. One conversation, recovered from surveillance of Salerno's Palmer Boys Social Club, captured what prosecutors argued was explicit discussion of commission-level business, including control of the concrete industry in New York City. An arrangement that prosecutors estimated was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent overcharges on construction contracts. The commission was not just governing crime. It was taxing an entire city's infrastructure. Giuliani addressed the press before trial with a directness that was itself a kind of prosecution argument. The charge is that these defendants constitute the ruling council of organized crime in the United States. If we can prove that, Marlem, and I believe we can, it will be the most significant organized crime prosecution in the history of the Justice Department. The trial began in September 1986. 8 defendants. A federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Stacks of wiretap transcripts entered into evidence. Witnesses who included former members operating under protection. The defense argued that the FBI had manufactured a mythology. Dino Lell, that the commission was a loose association, not a governing body, and that what the government called racketeering was simply how business was done in certain industries. The jury was unpersuaded. On November 19, 1986, all 8 defendants were convicted on all counts. The sentences were historic. Salerno received 100 years. Corallo, 100 years. Persico, 100 years. The sentences were designed not to punish crime. They were designed to remove men from the commission permanently. And in that, they succeeded. The conviction of the commission's leadership was not the end of the story. It was the proof of concept. RICO applied at the highest level dual crimes, but against the organization itself. Amtimdiala across the country began to apply the same template to other organized crime structures. The Mafia Commission trial became a model for what became, through the late 1980s and 1990s, a sustained dismantling of the institutional leadership of every major American crime family. Former FBI supervisory agent James Kostler, who worked on the commission case, described what the wiretap evidence revealed about the commission's actual decision-making processes. What was remarkable was how bureaucratic it was. These weren't dramatic meetings. They discussed business the way a board of directors might. They had disputes. They had procedures. They had politics. It was all organized. That's what people forget. The word in the name isn't there by accident. Gotti was not among the 1986 defendants. He had moved against Castellano after the indictments were filed. He stepped into a vacuum. But the same investigative apparatus that had brought down the commission's leadership was already turning toward him. His own conviction would come in 1992. 100 years, no parole. He died in federal custody in 2002. Here is what the 1986 verdict did not do. It did not end the commission. The structure Luciano had built in 1931 was designed at its core to be exactly this, resilient to the loss of any individual. New bosses emerged. Some were convicted within years. New bosses emerged after them. The commission, as a formal institution with scheduled meetings and settled procedures, was severely disrupted by the prosecutions of the 80s and 90s. But disrupted is not the same as dismantled. Law enforcement officials and academic researchers who have studied organized crime in America through the 2000s and beyond generally describe the same pattern. The five families diminished. Their reach contracted. Their revenue streams narrowed as federal pressure, informant penetration, and RICO prosecutions continued. But the organizations themselves did not cease to exist. They adapted. The precise structure of whatever commission equivalent exists today, if one exists, is by design and by prosecution attrition, not something the public record can describe with confidence. Investigators who have worked these cases in recent decades speak carefully when asked. The question of whether there is still a commission isn't one I can answer cleanly. What I can tell you is that the families still communicate. They still resolve disputes. How formally niagaro, that I don't know. That's the honest answer. The strangest part of this record is not what was done. It is how long the architecture was invisible, and how, even after it was named, convicted, and dismantled in its most recognizable form, it left no clean ending behind. The men went to prison. The institution bent. It did not break. Joseph Valachi died in federal custody in 1971, having never received the witness protection he was promised in its fullest form. Lucky Luciano died in Naples in 1962, officially of a heart attack, having spent his last 16 years in Italian exile, still, according to Italian police surveillance records, involved in narcotics coordination. The commission outlived both of them. What Luciano had understood Bumpernheim and what the record ultimately shows is that the commission's power was never personal. It was procedural. It was the procedure that was dangerous. The agenda items, the votes, the territorial maps, the understood rules about when a man could be killed and who had to say so first. That procedural logic, however battered, however reduced, proved more durable than any of the men who ran it. The Mafia Commission trial proved that the structure existed. The sentences proved it was taken seriously. The decades that followed proved that dismantling an institution, even with federal wiretaps, even with RICO, even with 100-year sentences, is not the same as ending the logic that built it. The men are gone. The logic remains. And in federal case files, in the organized crime units of field offices from New York to Chicago, that logic is still being tracked. The paper trail does not end. It just becomes harder to follow.